As leader of the of economic and rural development, one of the things that we do consider,
Order, please. The honourable member of economic and rural development has the floor. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Order. The member for the honourable minister has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as Minister responsible for the NSBI, I can tell you that I work very closely with NSBI, and we are always in constant communications, and we will continue. We will continue that trend.
Okay. The honourable leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure, Renewal, and is one of the ministers and one of the few who I believe understands the question and tries to answer it, so I'm happy to be asking it to him. The Colchester East Hants Health Authority recently issued an addendum to the regional hospital project in Truro. This will allow the use of USA-made drywall on the project. The call for tenders ends tomorrow. So my question to the minister is this: do you support the use of USA products over Canadian-made?
Okay. The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for the question. I know there's a supplemental coming, so having been in this House before, I'm really appreciative of the fact that my commitments have always been to the fact Canadian goods should be used in Canadian construction. So with that quick response, I'll turn it back to my learned friend.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will table the addendum. There are two businesses in Nova Scotia who produce the drywall. Supplying drywall to this project will protect Nova Scotian jobs. So my question to the minister is this: will he support this change when the work could be done by Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, member, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm looking forward to the documentation that you're going to table, and based upon the evidence that has been presented in the discussion that we're having here on the floor, it's something that I'll follow up with the member opposite. But thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, and your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, to the member, I would like to ask the minister if he would take action to have the closing date for this addendum extension so that proper representation can be made to save the work for Nova Scotians. Will you extend the date on the addendum?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite. It's a specific question, and I am not aware of all the details as was brought forward here on the floor, but I will assure the member opposite that when the question period, perhaps I should readjust that thing, but if I could get out of here before 5:02, I will make sure the staff stays on a little bit later today so I can get further information to respond specifically to that request. Thank you for your question.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Finance. Yesterday, the Minister of Finance made life more expensive for Nova Scotia families. As a measure to ease some of the hardship he has caused very low income Nova Scotians, the Minister talked about point-of-sales rebates. My question to the Minister is quite simple. Does he realize what various costs this new system will have for businesses to implement?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member knows very well, the HST system has a system of input tax credits for Nova Scotia businesses which are in place so that it's simply a flow through the business. So there will be no impact, no implementation costs. The system is already in place.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on your first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister well knows, yes, the HST, the GST is the flow-through. Point-of-sale rebate is a different matter. Mr. Speaker, obviously the Minister himself feels people need protection from his own policies. These measures that the Minister had to design in order to give very low-income families some degree of protection could have been avoided if the Finance Minister didn't take the easy road by increasing taxes. Businesses will have to update their computer and accounting systems to reflect the new tax rate and adjust to the point-of-sale rebate administration system. Some businesses will have to make these changes individually, just time-consuming. Businesses will also have to retrain employees on the new system. Mr. Speaker, did the Finance Minister give any thought whatsoever to the implications of this NDP tax?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As usual, the Liberals are just completely wrong, Mr. Speaker. They completely misunderstand the system and how it works. The system changes happened when they were the government and they brought the HST in, Mr. Speaker. And I would also say this, Mr. Speaker, we're not the first province in Canada to increase sales tax revenue this year. In fact, we're the fourth, after British Columbia and Ontario, which have gone to an HST system, and Quebec, which has also raised its sales tax. And perhaps the member could call those provinces, because the last time I checked, they're all Liberal governments.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But along with Prince Edward Island, we are the only two jurisdictions at 15% a standalone tax zone with 10% HST. Thanks to the NDP tax grab, businesses will now be responsible to update HST rate in sales equipment, such as cash registers, to correct the correct rate of tax, ensure any revenues collected via automated payments from customer bank accounts are appropriately adjusted, update price lists, catalogs, and other sales materials that are pre-printed with the new tax rate, update website online payment software for businesses that sell products and services over the internet, update accounts payable software, update input tax credit calculations, update taxable benefit calculations, update formulas and spreadsheets such as expense reports. Mr. Speaker, the question is simply, why is the NDP forcing the middle class and the working poor to pay for the government's poor planning?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we announced the measures that we took yesterday. It is a balanced approach. Where difficult choices are necessary, we've made those difficult choices. We've talked about spending restraint. We've talked about economic growth. We've talked about protecting health care, Mr. Speaker. And the one thing that is missing, is any answer from the Liberal Party. What would they do instead, Mr. Speaker? What would they cut, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, I understand that people...
Order. The Minister of Finance.
I understand that people say that there are other options, but what the Liberal Party advocates is more cutting. So my question to them is simple. What would they cut?
Okay. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question through you will be to the Deputy Premier. Strata has announced that it intends to move forward with a world-class coking mine. Can the Deputy Premier tell the people of Donkin, the people of Cape Breton, and indeed all of Nova Scotia, is he in favour of this mining project?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we welcome companies like Strata to Nova Scotia. I know, Mr. Speaker, they are an internationally respected mining corporation. Mr. Speaker, they will create jobs not only in Cape Breton West, but I would think throughout all of Cape Breton Island. So certainly we wish them well in their endeavours in Donkin.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my first supplement through you to this, Mr. Speaker, to the Deputy Premier. The Deputy Premier says that he is supportive of this project, and that's good news. Now, could the Deputy Premier explain to the community why he would never meet face-to-face with the Strata Coal Duncan Mine project manager, despite numerous requests being made to him?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think the member may have his facts mixed up or just simply wrong. That we and the member from Cape Breton Nova and the Premier, when he was opposition leader, toured that mine. I've met with various people from the Donkin project and will continue to do so whenever. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I don't think I have my facts wrong. I just think that you have a very poor memory because I know of the number of times that you were asked for a meeting and you would not do it. But to the Deputy Premier, I ask this question. You say you're concerned about the Cape Breton economy and the Nova Scotia economy. How is it you would fail to meet with this project manager of a project that has pumped $25 million into the area economy? It has the possibility of creating upwards of 1,000 jobs. It has the potential of pumping $30 to $40 million a year into the Nova Scotia government coffers. All of this being private money. These jobs are important to bring people home. They are important to the community. Why aren't they important to the Deputy Premier?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I've met with Mr. Estman that there was times when our schedules conflicted, but I've met with him, and I said again that we've toured that project, we've supported it. He's, if I wasn't available, he certainly talked to senior members of this government. So, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I'll say this, Mr. Speaker, again, that we're supportive of this. It's going in the right direction, and we support it going forward, Mr. Speaker, no matter what the naysayers in that party say.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Information provided to the Minister and the Department of Health clearly outlines that if Lucentis was funded, government would save $2.5 million in direct costs in 1 year alone, with millions more to be saved in indirect costs associated with blindness. Mr. Speaker, that is what we would call a strategic investment. While in opposition, the NDP were very vocal when it came to the funding of Lucentis, and now in government they have been silent. My question to the Minister is, why don't Nova Scotians have access to Lucentis?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Health provides more than $240 million annually for drugs. The drug Lucentis is not one of the drugs that we have approved for funding, Mr. Speaker, and that hasn't changed, Mr. Speaker, with this spring budget.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, Newfoundland, and our neighbour New Brunswick all fund Lucentis. That leaves only Nova Scotia and PEI as the last two holdouts. Others see the benefit of this worthwhile investment, but clearly this government does not. With a net cost of $2.5 million to government this year, my question to the Minister is, why hasn't the Minister been able to find the money for this worthwhile investment within her budget envelope, which did increase by $200 million this year?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, first of all, I would say to the Honourable Member, Mr. Speaker, that my numbers and her numbers certainly do not jive, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the cost of Lucentis this year would be $4.5 to $5 million. And, Mr. Speaker, over the next 3 years, that would bill to be more than a $10 million pressure in terms of the expenditure. That's for one drug, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as you're very well aware, new drugs are coming on the market all the time. It puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the budget of the Department of Health to pick up the costs of these additional drugs. Mr. Speaker, that's why our government is implementing a drug management policy unit. We will be looking to find the most up-to-date and the most affordable way for Nova Scotians to get the health care that they need, including drugs, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on your final supplementary.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, we're hearing a different story from the minister today than we did when she was in opposition, because she clearly understood the many social costs there are to blindness, and that this is a disease that's devastating to those who can't afford that drug. Now, if you have the money in Nova Scotia, you can get this drug, but if you're relying on pharmacare, you cannot, and blindness is what you'll get. And I don't think that that's right in this province, and more than 95% of Canadians have access to this drug. So I think the minister needs to review her numbers and measure the cost of rehabilitation and societal costs and just the cost of blindness. So my final question to the minister is, how long do Nova Scotians have to wait for the coverage of Lucentis?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I've said, drugs make up a very large percentage of the department's budget, Mr. Speaker, but we're very committed to getting the most affordable deal for Nova Scotians to ensure that they have the drug coverage that they require. We will be setting up a policy unit, drug management policy unit in the department, Mr. Speaker, not only so that people will have access in the future to drugs like Lucentis, but all of the other drugs as well, Mr. Speaker, that people require for their health care. Thank you.
I had the Progressive Conservative Party down here next for a question, but the honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development. Today marks a week since the agreement ended providing operational and maintenance support for the Point Tupper to Sydney portion of the Cape Breton and Central Railroad. The Premier and his cabinet are either committed to the railroad or they're not. So far, it appears that they are not, as evidenced by the couldn't care less attitude of the Minister of Economic and Rural Development. Mr. Speaker, will the minister inform this House if he's committed to maintaining rail service for Cape Breton? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise in my place. With respect to Cape Breton Rail, we are still negotiating. I've said all along, and I continue to say this, negotiations are ongoing. We've extended between us, we've extended the timeline. We've got work and operations still continue for the next month. Cape Breton Rail and the province of Nova Scotia are in honest and earnest dialogue with one another.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on 2 previous rounds of negotiations have been held and the results were a positive outcome. On both occasions, it happened as a result of recognition and appreciation of the importance of the rail, a strategic infrastructure vital to hundreds of jobs in Cape Breton now and to the future economic development and commercialization of our Sydney Harbour. If the railroad presents a business case consistent with the previous 2 agreements, will the Dexter NDP invest in Cape Breton's future, or will they put the island's future in peril, as it seems to be the attitude of this minister? The Minister of Transportation seems to have his priorities straight. Why can't you, Mr. Minister?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
I'm not sure if there was a question there, but again,
Order.
Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm just repeating that we are very actively in negotiations with Cape Breton Rail. Work continues on Cape Breton Rail. They are operating the rail as if as they were yesterday. That will continue. We will continue to dialogue with them, and when those negotiations conclude, I will be making a recommendation to Cabinet.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the bad attitude and hollow platitudes from the Dexter NDP government about Cape Breton are shaking the confidence of business and citizens alike on the island. The Dexter NDP didn't hesitate for a moment to deficit finance $100 million for land. Yet they won't invest $25 million towards the continuation of rail service and the commercialization of Sydney Harbour. Why is it, Mr. Speaker, why is it that the Dexter NDP will invest in dirt, yet treat rural Nova Scotians like dirt? Will you or won't you support Cape Breton's economic infrastructure? Your party made lots of promises during a campaign, but honouring commitments seems to be hard for this government to do. Is this minister going to support Cape Breton?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government has supported all of Nova Scotians, and we.
Order. The Honourable Minister has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government, as I have already said, continues to support all Nova Scotians, regardless of where they live, whether it be in Cape Breton or whether it be on the mainland. We are very supportive.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, on Sunday, March 28, residents throughout Richmond County gathered in the Lardwise Community Centre for the kickoff of the fundraising campaign for the new WB Kingston Community Health Centre. The new centre will provide a range of health and medical services and will replace the 130-year-old building currently housing the medical clinic. The total cost to build the new health centre is $1.5 million. The community itself has committed to raising $250,000. Enterprise Cape Breton Corporation has committed $500,000. The municipality of Richmond has committed $250,000. And the province of Nova Scotia has committed. Well, that's the reason for my question, Mr. Speaker. Okay. Will the Minister of Health, who is also the Minister of Health Promotion, tell the residents of Richmond County why the province and her government has not committed funds for the new WB Kingston Community Health Centre?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, health facilities around the province are capital projects which are in fact funded by the Department of Health. However, the Department of Health is not a funder of community health centres in terms of capital construction and infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, those kinds of plans and requirements go to the district health authorities, and perhaps the community health centre has submitted a proposal to the district health authority for their centre. If that's the case, I'm not aware of it, but I'd be happy to look into it for the honourable member.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on your first supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, the previous government, when the board went to see them, said, well, go see tourism and culture under the Sport and Recreation Fund, sent them over to put in a proposal for the funding that was being sent for private partnerships over in BC, got the complete runaround. And now this minister's saying, put in an application to the DHA. The fact is that the Department of Health is not providing any funding for capital construction of these community health clinics. And if the minister doesn't know that by now, then we've got serious issues in this province. Mr. Speaker, on October 26, 2009, WB Kingston Clinic Chair Renee Sampson wrote to the Minister of Health and stated, quote, despite words of praise and encouragement, as of this date, we have not received any kind of financial commitment from the provincial government, end quote. Could the Minister of Health inform the House whether she has responded to this letter or made any arrangements to meet with the board of the WB Kingston Clinic?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, I want to say to the honourable member that in the Department of Health, we do not fund the building of community health centres. We fund the operation of community health centres. We fund the doctors, the nurses, and the other personnel who work in community health centres. However, in terms of capital infrastructure, it is not the practice of the Department of Health to fund the centre in the members' riding or the centre in any other constituency around the province, Mr. Speaker. But whether or not that centre has approached the DHA or the department with a proposal is something I'm prepared to do some investigation on and look into, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Richmond on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what's said here is that the board of the centre are volunteers. They give of their time. They're trying to do something good for the community. And how upsetting it is to watch the provincial government continue to give them the runaround. The minister initially said in her first reply they should apply to the DHA for funding for capital construction. Then she turned around and said, we don't do capital construction, neither through the DHAs, but we help with the operating costs. The fact is, this medical clinic doesn't need help with the operating costs. The way the clinic is set up, it will pay for itself once it's built, but they need the money to be able to build it. I asked the minister a specific question. Did she reply to the letter of October 26, 2009? She didn't answer it, because the fact is she didn't reply. And if she's looking for their business plan, it was attached with the letter of October 26, 2009. Will the Minister of Health explain today, and explain more importantly, to the residents, to the new doctor that's located in the community, to the new nurse practitioner that's there, and to the hard-working board of directors, why did you not see fit to sit down and read that letter and at least give them the dignity of a reply?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, frankly, what is sad is not that the Department of Health doesn't fund the capital construction, but it's in fact that the member doesn't want to hear the instructions that I'm giving him about what might be a very helpful way to get money so that centre, in fact, can be built, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. Order. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage. Mr. Speaker, the Chronicle Herald headline on page 4 yesterday blared, "Taxing Times in Tourism," and I'll table that, citing the fact the tourism industry will be warding off a blow if the HST is hiked. We all know what happened. The Cat Ferry shut down, and a dollar that's on par with its American counterpart are also keeping American tourists away. My question through you to the Minister, what are you and your government planning to tell the 40,000 individuals employed in Nova Scotia's tourism industry, and what are you doing to alleviate the concerns within that industry?
The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Heritage and Culture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. There are a lot of things going on in tourism. First of all, I've got to say that this is very challenging times for all of us. One of the things that we've been very fortunate in Nova Scotia is that when it comes to tourism, we've been able to pretty well hold our own. And part of the reason that we've been able to hold our own when it comes to tourism, a $1.3 billion industry, Mr. Speaker, is because of strategies. It's because of the good work of the department. We don't stop. We continuously come up with ways, strategize with stakeholders, with members of the community, and with people from tie-ins to the heritage and culture sector, to all those units that contribute to tourism in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, we should be speaking the praises of the Department of Tourism.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, $825,000 was spent on advertising in the United States in 2009 2010, compared to 1.4 million in Europe, with a major emphasis on the United Kingdom. With visitation down from the United States, my question to the minister is, are you spending more, less, or just the same in trying to lure American tourists this summer?
The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Heritage and Culture.
Mr. Speaker, times have changed. The way people shop for adventures in tourism have changed in the last 5, 10, 15 years. We do a lot of now online searching. What we've done in the Department of Tourism is one of the reasons that our numbers have remained competitive is because we've changed with the changing times. One of the things, the stay vacation. We did a lot of concentration in the past year of tours within the Atlantic region and within Canada. We are also looking at niche marketing in the United States. So we are looking at new markets in the United States, and some of those traditional markets may be a little bit worn out, and we've got to be on the edge. And that's where we are, Mr. Speaker. And again, we should be praising the Department of Tourism for keeping the industry as a $1.3 billion industry.
The Honourable Member from Victoria the Lakes, and your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, through you again to the minister. In an email, one of the province's major tourism operators has informed me as tourism critic that normally one U.S. motor coach with this company normally typically books around 18,000 rooms. This year, they've booked only 14,500 rooms. The decrease is because they have to travel through New Brunswick. Mr. Minister, this is a loss of 3,500 rooms for 2010. What do you say to hotel operators across Nova Scotia? Why was there no discussion held as to how the government might assist them in compensating for this fiscal blow of over $500,000?
I would remind members to address the chair when they're asking the question to the minister. The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Heritage and Culture.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Mr. Speaker, we work with industry stakeholders on a daily basis. We are in touch and in contact and continue to dialogue with the Hotel Association, with all of the stakeholders, Mr. Speaker. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I don't know what it's going to take to get the message across, is that we've maintained a level of tourism in the province of Nova Scotia which other jurisdictions envy. They envy that. Mr. Speaker, we've done so much, and it's an effort. It's an effort on our part to maintain that $1.3 billion industry, and we will continue to do that, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Deputy Premier. Mr. Speaker, there was a lot of talk yesterday, a lot of discussion around spending, a lot of debate around cost and payments. The only thing there wasn't much discussion around was on a ferry service between Yarmouth and the United States. So my first question to the Deputy Premier, why did your government completely abandon the people of southwestern Nova Scotia by cancelling the CAT ferry this season?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, as we meet for this question period in this House today, the Premier is in Yarmouth meeting with the stakeholders. Mr. Speaker,
Order, please. The Deputy Premier has the floor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the people that obviously have a crystal ball over there are saying a version of facts that just quite aren't accurate, Mr. Speaker. And to enlighten them, Mr. Speaker, the Premier led them to a meeting at the local newspaper, and they were glad to follow him, Mr. Speaker, as most Nova Scotians are. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Clare, on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I hope the Premier will be able to provide an answer today in Yarmouth, because his Minister of Economic Development certainly hasn't provided a single answer yet as to why they could not extend a subsidy for 1 year. You know, and that's what the people of this region was looking for, Mr. Speaker, 1 year of help. You know, the people of this region needed economic guidance and a helping hand. So my question to the Deputy Premier, does your government really believe that the $600,000 you saved from the buyout with Bay Ferries will save southwestern Nova Scotia from your reckless decision to shut down a ferry service?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, but the one thing I will agree with the member in the question is there was reckless spending around that CAT, but it wasn't by this government, Mr. Speaker. We were prudent with Canadians' dollars. We were prudent with Nova Scotians' dollars. Mr. Speaker, we are leading the way in the resurrection of the economy of Southwest Nova. Follow us. We will get you there, not by spending money on a ferry that was going down, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Clare on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, everyone knows that the CAT ferry was not viable. This is not a revolutionary statement from government. This is an international highway link, Mr. Speaker. Surely the NDP government and the federal Conservatives could have found a financial subsidy to keep this ferry service going until a viable option could be found. So my final question to the Deputy Premier, why wasn't a one-year subsidy granted for the CAT ferry to avoid economic ruin in southwestern Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to get involved with the economic hyperbole that the members are engaging in across the way, Mr. Speaker, because it's just not so, Mr. Speaker. What we did the prudent fiscal thing for Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, that ferry was costing us over $400 a passenger. That was not sustainable. That was not go forward, Mr. Speaker, and we did what was in the best interest of all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development. Mr. Speaker, on March 9th, 2010, the Minix call centre in Port Hawkesbury announced that on April 30th, 94 people will be laid off. In discussions with the MLA from Inverness, we both realised that this is a significant blow to the community, as well as the broader areas of Victoria County, Inverness, Richmond and Antigonish, as well as the local economy. My question through you to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development is, what has this government done to prevent these 94 people from losing their jobs?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
You know, Mr. Speaker, the question is, what have we done to prevent people from losing their jobs? And in the case of Maniacs, this came as a surprise to us when they made the announcement that some people were losing their jobs. And as a matter of fact, my understanding is that that there's a possibility that Maniacs may not close, that they're looking at other customers, and you know, we're there to help, and any way that we can help Maniacs or any contact centers in the province of Nova Scotia, we're there for them.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for a community the size of Port Hawkesbury, the loss of 94 jobs is devastating. The need in the community will be great. And again, my question through you to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development. What is the government's plan to help those displaced by the layoffs if they do take place?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And one of the arms that we have in the government is that the member opposite may be well aware of is through the Department of Education, Labour and Workforce Management, and we will be working with Maniacs, with the Regional Development Authority, with the municipality, and again, I reiterate is that we will do anything and everything humanly possible from our end as far as assisting Maniacs to stay in Port Hawkesbury.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes on your final supplementary.
Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, this government's lack of regard for the well-being of rural Nova Scotians is becoming increasingly clear. Through you, could the minister outline steps he has personally taken which will result in a strengthened economic development strategy for rural Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I could be here for a while. We've done a lot, and I've actively been involved with DSME, with their relocation in Trenton Works. I've been actively involved with IMP, not only with IMP, but also with the IMP contact centers in Windsor. You know, what I can do, if the member would like, I could certainly through staff provide him with a very, very healthy and lengthy list of things that have taken place in the last 10 or 11 months. There have been contact. You know, sometimes we laugh at contact centers, and when I say we, I don't mean this side of the House. Contact centers have provided a very valuable service to the province of Nova Scotia. Not to mention those in the financial sector. We've been able to lure people in the financial sector.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, a question was asked.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you. I'll recognize the Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Does the Minister support federal per-student funding of post-secondary education?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, various governments have tried to encourage the federal government to support post-secondary student funding rather than doing it by the population-based formula. So it's something that my department is considering very seriously, but certainly it would bring more post-secondary funding in from the federal government, and it's worth taking a look at. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has the minister gone to Ottawa to lobby the federal government to change the per capita formula to per student? And if so, what was the result?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly there are a number of avenues to dialogue and lobby with the federal government. Intergovernmental affairs is one, and certainly Nova Scotia does most of its consultation with the federal government through the Council of Education Ministers Canada, and I'm actually the vice chair of that organization, and we work very closely with the other provinces in trying to interest the federal government in putting more money into post-secondary education across Canada. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the problem with the minister's answer is that some of the other members on that council are not in favour of that kind of a funding change. So my question is, will the Minister of Education commit today to fight for Nova Scotia taxpayers, for students, to make sure they aren't picking up, say, Ontario's tab? This isn't fair.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government puts the interest of Nova Scotian families and students ahead of everything, and we will do whatever is necessary to provide as much money as possible for post-secondary education in this province from all sources. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland South.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question will be for the Deputy Premier. Mr. Speaker, through you to the Deputy, you know, this government in 10 short months has and continues to break every promise and commitment it possibly could. Balanced budgets, gone. No new taxes, gone. Honour commitments of the previous government, and I'll table, Mr. Speaker, again for the House, where the Premier Dexter, said he would honour commitments, of course, broken word, broken promises. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Deputy is this. Why did the Dexter government during the election, and why does the Dexter government continue to mislead Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, through you to the member, we have not. We are providing the proper government. We are moving forward as clearly set out here yesterday by the Minister of Finance, a way out of the fiscal mess that the former government left us in, Mr. Speaker, and we're moving forward. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland South on your first supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, excuse me, through you to the Deputy Premier again. We've received information through the Freedom of Information request that, in fact, the decision to replace 2 correctional facilities, one in Antigonish and one in Spring Hill, were made some time ago, and in fact, to replace one in the Glasgow area. For all the NDP bluster around being able to afford the project, the decision was made, and then staff were given direction to come up with a business plan and numbers on the one facility. My question now, Mr. Speaker, will be to the Minister of Justice. How can you convince anyone that your actions or decisions are in the best interest of the justice system, Spring Hill, Cumberland County, and not political?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for that question, and I'm very happy to answer that question. Unlike the previous administration that just made a decision, there's absolutely no business case to support the decision for the jail to go in Spring Hill and Antigonish. It was a decision in and of itself. However, this government and this ministry has put forth a plan where the business case is being developed, and when the thing's completed, a decision will be made, and there's no announcement as to where that site is. And I'm glad that he does outline my riding, but I don't even think there's a site in the riding.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland South on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Minister of Justice would care to read answer, what I had said was in the New Glasgow area, which to me would be Pictou County. However, Mr. Speaker, it's this government, this Minister and the Premier who have broken their word and broken their commitments to Nova Scotians. That's very clear. Nova Scotians are seeing that, Mr. Speaker. I sat in meetings with the Minister of Justice where he had said that he was not ruling anything out, and I know that that information was misleading to the people of Cumberland County. In fact, Mr. Speaker, in light of what the Minister just said, I'll read through the Freedom of Information, a email that was from a very senior person in his department to a very senior person in corrections. And it says, the Minister in the press has referred to a business case. I don't know what rationale went into the recommendation to locate the jail around New Glasgow, but we need some facts and figures, a business case. I am copying Diana because she was involved and will have some information. You will need her to help pull together a business case ASAP. Pretty clear, Mr. Speaker. Pretty clear what's going on here. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister is, how can Nova Scotians trust the Dexter NDP government when they clearly have misled the people of Spring Hill, Cumberland County, and Nova Scotia? I will table that. No question about it, Deputy Premier. They are misleading Nova Scotians. People in my area want to know why.
The Honourable the Deputy Premier. The Deputy Premier.
Is it the Minister or me? Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had the pleasure of going to Spring Hill early in this whole discussion on the decision with the jail, and went out and spoke with the member in question and discussed this very issue. So I'm not clear where he's coming from, but I would like to see those documents. My instructions to my staff is that we have to have a very transparent system where we put forth a good business case to justify where the jail is and the expenditure. Unlike the previous administration, we will spend our dollars in the best interest of all Nova Scotians, and we will have a clear business case which will be available to the people of Nova Scotia to see how the decision was made in the process, and that it was sound, logical, and accountable.
The order, please. The Honourable Member for Digby Annapolis.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to raise an issue again today that's been raised in this House many times, and that issue is the unfinished 101 101 series highways from Digby to Weymouth in western Nova Scotia. For more than 35 years, the people who have lived on this dangerous stretch of road have been asking, when will we get this increasing 100 series highway traffic off our front doorsteps? Mr. Speaker, my question is, when can these people expect to see the 101 highway between Digby and Weymouth constructed, or at least a path cut through the alders where the highway should be?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question, and although the reference to alders will have to be passed at this time. I also want to acknowledge the fact that the member opposite has taken the time to meet with myself and staff and very clearly enunciated the wishes of his community when it comes to this important project. This is an important project because of the safety and the people in that particular part of Nova Scotia as they make their way to and from work, to and from school. And having traveled the road many times, I share some of those concerns. All that being said, and I know the member has heard me say it to him privately and in the presence of the deputy and various other members of staff, considering some of the financial restrictions that we're under at this time, it is one of the projects that is not going to be addressed immediately, but is a project of importance to that member, and I want him to know that he's being listened to in the Department of Transportation. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Digby Annapolis on your first supplementary.
What the people in Digby and Annapolis have heard for 35 years. Mr. Speaker, it looks as though the people in that area will lose a major bus carrier in the region, along with the ferry system. With no bus system, no rail system, no ferry, all the people have left is maybe some hope that a new road may be built. Mr. Speaker, the completion of the highway between Digby and Weymouth has never been more important. So my question is, will the minister make a commitment today and provide a safe and secure piece of highway between Digby and Weymouth?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite. I know the member opposite shares the concerns that I have when it comes to traveling that section of highway. I know there's a major transportation study underway, and it's going to be interesting to see, particularly as we look at some of the solutions for that particular part of Nova Scotia. But I have to say to the member in all conscience, and I appreciate your patience and your decorum in bringing the matter forward. At this time, I cannot give you the assurances that you're asking. I cannot make that commitment at this time based upon financial restrictions. But I want the member opposite to know that his requests and his point of view certainly got the attention of this minister and the Transportation Department of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Digby Annapolis on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the people who live along this dangerous piece of road have nearly lost all hope of ever getting that traffic off their doorsteps. Mr. Speaker, I've made a commitment to the people of that area that I'm just going to stay at this job until that highway is built. Or at least get them some hope that it's going to be built. I'm even giving up. My question to the minister, there's been lots of talk. There's been lots of talk about paving and highway construction this past year with stimulus funding. And the people living on Highway number 1 between Digby need a little bit of hope that someday maybe this road will be built. Can the minister confirm today that he will look into and maybe give those people a little bit of hope that someday, at least someday, that road may be started?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite. Let's get this out of the way from the very beginning. Under no circumstances do I want that member to no longer be part of this House. Mr.
Order. The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
And Mr. Speaker, I first of all, I again compliment the member for his passion on this topic. It's one of the issues that we, of course, are looking at, particularly when it comes to federal dollars and infrastructure money. And I want the member opposite to know that it is a concern for the department. It is a concern for that part of Western Nova Scotia. I'm not going to make light of the fact of the possible threat. Hopefully the road will be addressed in a timely fashion, and hopefully the member opposite will have spent many long years in this House to see a safe road in the number 1 between Digby and Weymouth.
The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you will be to the Minister of Natural Resources. The province of Nova Scotia recently acquired land in Cumberland County from J.D. Irving, Rossay Limited, and Wagner as well. As the Minister would know, on some of the privately owned land, permission was allowed in the past for camps, cottages, and for owners to erect buildings and maintain them, and this has gone on for over the past decades. Now, under the ownership of the province, and before this transaction actually took place, these building owners were given 2 options. In January, they were offered to sign an agreement to have their buildings removed by this fall, and if they wouldn't sign, then they had to have them out by the following week. Can the Minister explain to the House why the Dexter NDP government is using Nova Scotians so unfairly?
The Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I have to say that I don't agree with the member's premise that we're using Nova Scotians unfairly. He certainly is aware of the land purchase. He has that correct. The issue he raises is, I would say, a fairly delicate one in the sense that there were camp leases on those lands owned by those private companies, and part of the agreement in that purchase was that those companies were to see to it that the people who owned had those leases, that they were to be terminated or whatever. That didn't turn out to be the case in all cases, Mr. Speaker. We have kind of pushed back our deadline to see what might be possible. In some instances, we've been thinking that it might be possible for those individuals to buy that piece of land and own it. One gentleman expressed an interest, if he could stay long enough, thought he might move his camp across the ice to another location, and we told him he could keep it there for this summer and see what happened with. We're going to kind of look at the overall policy in regard to those camp leases by the Crown anyway, but we're trying to help those individuals as much as possible.
Okay. The honourable member for Cumberland South on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for the answer. For that answer, I've spoken personally with some of these individuals who have received these removal notices from the private landowner, and their concern is as the Minister I'm sure would appreciate, a lot of these people have made huge investments in their properties, and it's simply not fair to force them to remove these buildings. Many have strong family ties to these properties, as they would have spent many years with their families gathering at these camps and cottages to enjoy times together. I'm asking the Minister today on behalf of the owners of these camps and cottages in my area of Cumberland County if their Minister will give some consideration to allowing at least this present generation of owners to be grandfathered and to maintain these buildings and be allowed to continue to enjoy these under public ownership as they have in the past under private ownership.
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that's a pretty reasonable request, I think, by the member opposite. The member for Cumberland North has raised this issue with me as well. And actually, it has been a consideration that I've asked my staff to look at on the general policy of camp leases, so that the party that presently has the lease, if we could look at them having that for their lifespan, or we might even put a time limit on it, but make them non-transferable. But anyway, we haven't totally nailed down which direction we're going. We are trying to do it in a way that we think would be in the best interest of the property, the lessees there, and we'll try to decide in the best interest of them in this kind of overall policy direction, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cumberland South on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister again for the answer. Mr. Speaker, I would ask through you to the Minister if the Minister would agree to table in this House copies of the contracts and all related documentation, emails, transmissions, letters, etc. that would have come with the contracts that would show discussions between the Province of Nova Scotia, Department of Natural Resources, J.D. Irving Limited, Rossay Paper, and Wagner, so Nova Scotians see exactly what discussions took place and what agreements were reached in regards to this transaction.
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
If I can, I will. If I can't, I won't, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question is for the Minister of Agriculture, and I hope I don't get the same answer. Mr. Speaker, it's a new day in Nova Scotia, or so we've been told. What isn't new is the lack of initiative from the NDP government to aid our agriculture industries. It doesn't appear as though an increase of $1 will be seen to help Nova Scotia farmers in a new budget. My question to the Minister, what is your government's plan to help our agricultural industries in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
I think the member would be aware that if his question is pointed toward the budget, I can't answer that question. I think his question is probably too general in the time period that we have. He would know about the interest buy dam program for beef producers, which has had this, I think, a significant uptake. And so I think he'll have to ask me commodity by commodity in order to get the whole industry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on your first supplementary.
And I will be more specific, and an area that the Minister in opposition was very positive on. Mr. Speaker, markets do not currently provide Nova Scotia farmers with a reasonable return for their production activities. Farms are shutting down, families moving off the family farm. Last fall, I asked the Minister about implementing recommendations to Kelco report, a report that is support the hog, beef, sheep, horticulture and fruit sectors. Nova Scotia farmers need decisive action from our government. They need it now, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Minister, have you examined the recommendations from the Kelco report, and when can we expect you to come back with input from this important document?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure if it was my intention to come back with input from this document to the House. I have asked my staff to look at the Kelco report, actually to look at the entire value chain to see if there is some way for government to intervene in order for producers to get what they need out of the value chain. The member opposite, he does raise a good issue. He would be aware that the supply managed commodities have a mechanism for doing that, Mr. Speaker. But for those others, actually, that study of the value chain by my department will soon be complete, and I hope to gain some insights, and whatever I can share with the member opposite, I would be quite glad to share with him at that time.
The Honourable Member Kings West on your final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And with just a few seconds remaining today's question period, one other area of interest to farmers, of high interest to farmers, is when will you provide an exact date in 2010 for your government's 10-year plan for agriculture?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Soon, very soon.
Thank you. Order. The time for oral question periods has expired, and I believe I'll recognize the Honourable House Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, would you call Bill number 14?
Bill number 14. The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise in the House today to speak on Bill 14, a bill to prohibit the province from proposing or agreeing to an increase in the provincial portion of the federally enacted harmonized sales tax. Mr. Speaker, the HST. We heard yesterday that we must brace for an increase in the HST. What does this mean for business? Well, one comment made by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business was that it was disastrous, this budget. It means for business that things become more expensive for Nova Scotia consumers. They will have less disposable income. It's money out of people's pockets, and it's money out of our local economies. This does nothing to improve the morale of Nova Scotians after going through an economic downturn. People will start to lose faith. They will say, why bother? Why bother earning more money when you have to pay more tax? And I think people are starting to get to a point in this province where they feel like giving up. We're some of the highest taxed people in the country. Now, I will say that there were measures in the budget to protect those with incomes under $30,000. And I can see the logic in that, Mr. Speaker. But I will say this. What about creating an environment for people who are earning $30,000 and under so that they may have opportunities to earn more for a living? And I think when we look at taxes, the more we increase them, the more we decrease business and economic opportunity from reaching those people. I want to draw to your attention, Mr. Speaker, the small business tax proposed. Now, while this is not the HST, it is another tax. And in the budget that was presented, a balanced budget that was presented in the spring of 2009, there was a plan to reduce tax to 4% this year, 3% next year, and 2.5% the following year, effectively cutting the small business tax rate in half. Now, there was a change yesterday, and I commend the minister for recognizing the small business community by reducing the tax. But I do want to point out that it's not by the same amount of reduction that had been proposed in the spring 2009 balanced budget. Mr. Speaker, the HST, how big of an issue is this in Nova Scotia? Does it really make a difference? Well, I will point to this. There was a company in this very city who was advertising the sale of automobiles before this increase in HST. So it makes a difference, and it will bear in people's minds when they go to make purchases. And I will also say that increased taxes don't always bring a direct linear correlation with tax revenue. People may spend less, and you may not get the same amount of tax as you would like to get in this case. I want to also draw to people's attention the fact that the Premier Dexter, had promised no new tax increases, and we saw them yesterday. We have today the reputation of having the highest consumption taxes in North America. This is not good. This is nothing to be proud about. And I do find it ironic that the federal government opposed not the federal government, the federal NDP party opposed HST increases in Ontario and in BC. So I wonder why Premier Dexter disagrees with his federal counterparts. How will this affect working Nova Scotians? Well, we think that the province should be lowering taxes. We think that government should be made smaller. We think that government should know its costs. And I'm sure that the finance minister took a good reading of costs, and I know I've heard him make comments about that. But one thing is very important is that if the government is only taking in so much revenue, decisions need to be made. And it's not good enough to pass on debt to future generations. It's not acceptable to the Progressive Conservative Caucus, Mr. Speaker. And we believe that a government should have a culture where things matter, where it matters to make sure the budgets are balanced, where it matters when there's decisions being made in departments, where it matters that money is not spent where it's not needed to be spent. In the private sector, companies could not run their businesses like this. In our government, I would propose that we should not be running government like this. When the NDP was in opposition, they had all the answers. Today, the only answer they have for the people of Nova Scotia is increased taxes. Deficits. Let's place the debt on the back of future Nova Scotians. One thing that economists look at when they look at a province's economy is they look at the debt to GDP ratio. And as debt grows and GDP remains flat like we have in this province, that's not a good thing. And that's the first thing that economists are going to look at when they look at this budget. And Mr. Speaker, I want to say that I did some research. I looked at bond ratings, and I asked a question to someone involved in the bond rating industry: what would the effect of a deficit be in this province? And in fairness to the minister, I don't expect there'll be any bond rating changes with the budget yesterday. But if there are continued deficit budgets, investors will start to look at buying the province of Nova Scotia bonds, and they will start to say there's some risk attached to these bonds. And what happens then, Mr. Speaker? The price on those bonds goes up. And effectively, that means it's going to cost us more to borrow money. That's not a good thing. This government has tried to be all things to all people. That philosophy has proven time and time again in the business world to fail. And it will fail here in Nova Scotia with this government, Mr. Speaker. This government should be focused on growing the economy, but instead, it's focused on taxes, it's focused on purchasing land at a time when we don't have the money to do it, and it's focused on running deficit budgets. These initiatives will not grow the economy. They will squeeze the life out of the commerce in Nova Scotia to feed this government's need to be all things to all people. Now, you can complain about the past, Mr. Speaker, which I've heard this government do on many times since I've entered this House. But I will say that leaders are not complainers, and they don't make excuses. Leaders take responsibility. If they took responsibility, we would have a balanced budget, Mr. Speaker, not a deficit. Show leadership. Be responsible. Balance the budget. There is no alternative. Don't blame it on the economy. We have a defensive economy in Nova Scotia. We don't depend on an auto sector. We don't depend on a cyclical industry like oil and gas in Alberta. We have a defensive economy. And the recovery is continuing all across the country, which means better federal revenues for our province. I think we should be doing the right thing. I think we should be balancing the budget. I think we should be doing it today, Mr. Speaker. It will make a difference tomorrow. Now, I know this from my past experience helping people personally with their finances. Decisions today, even small decisions, make a big difference over time. And running deficits is not good for the future. Even small deficits will make a significant difference for this province. It will make things worse for our future. This bill was introduced because I believe that an HST increase will hurt the economy. And I believe it will hurt those earning less than $30,000 here in Nova Scotia, perhaps not through the offsetting measures in the budget, but it will hurt their opportunity to gain employment opportunities to earn more than $30,000. The Progressive Conservatives are proud of our record of fiscal restraint. We delivered 8 balanced budgets. When Premier Ham was in power, the $830 million check we received from offshore royalties from the federal government was put directly on the debt. The NDP record is deficits and future debt for people in this province. The future we envision for this province, Mr. Speaker, will not happen for Nova Scotians through tax increases. And that is why I have introduced this bill, Bill 14. And I ask that members from all sides of this House support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, very much. Mr. Speaker, making all due allowances for the fact that that member is new, it's difficult for me to understand how he could have so little appreciation for what his party did over the last decade, Mr. Speaker. That government, that member has said publicly and then again in here, Mr. Speaker, that he believes that government should be smaller. Well, Mr. Speaker, all I can say is that his party, when they were in government for the last decade, had a very peculiar way of showing that, because government expenditure rose at a compound rate, Mr. Speaker, of 5% per year, every year for a decade. And when John Ham was first elected in 1999, Mr. Speaker, the expenditure of the government of Nova Scotia was $5 billion. And Mr. Speaker, in only 10 years, After a change of leadership, they left expenditure of $9 billion, Mr. Speaker, compounded growth, adding up to 80%, Mr. Speaker, over 10 years. And the only reason they were able to do that, Mr. Speaker, is the economy was going well, money was pouring into the Treasury from offshore royalties, among other things, and so the revenue was pouring in and the expenditures, Mr. Speaker, were pouring out, because that crowd, when they were in government, all they knew how to do was spend, spend, spend. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask these questions again because so far I still haven't heard any answers. Why did that previous government allow the Colchester Hospital to go $80 million over budget? Imagine what we could do with that money, Mr. Speaker, if they hadn't been so far off in their projections. Why, Mr. Speaker, knowing that H1N1 was coming, did they put in $0 and 0 cents in their budget in May 2009, Mr. Speaker? Why is it that knowing that there were hundreds of public sector collective agreements open, did they put zero money in the budget to actually pay for them, Mr. Speaker? They left us, Mr. Speaker, in other words, with a mess. I wish they didn't. I wish the mess they left us wasn't so big, but it is. And we are left to deal with the situation as it is, Mr. Speaker, not as we wish it would be, or, Mr. Speaker, as they might wish it would be. So what we've done, Mr. Speaker, is we have engaged in the most extensive financial consultations in the province's history. Because I, Mr. Speaker, believe in the collective wisdom of the people. And that side are trying very hard to dismiss the process. But, Mr. Speaker, you know what? It was an outstanding success. And I don't mind saying, Mr. Speaker, that I and this government will listen to the people. And what happened, Mr. Speaker, is that when people sat down and looked at the facts, and looked at the options, they said, all right, here's what we want you to do. And I listened to that message very carefully. Among other things, Mr. Speaker, I got the message in every room I was in, everywhere across the province, that the right time back to balance was 3 to 5 years. And that is exactly what is embodied in the budget, Mr. Speaker, because we listen to the people and we agree. Now, that member says, first in public and now here in the House, that the budget I delivered yesterday should have been balanced. Okay, that's a respectable position, but that's only the beginning of the debate, Mr. Speaker. It's not the end, because what that member won't do, can't do, refuses to do, is to say how he would do it. Now, Mr. Speaker, the only way to deliver a budget yesterday, a balanced budget yesterday, first of all, is to ignore what the people are saying to us, Mr. Speaker. I'm not willing to do that, even if that member is, Mr. Speaker. The only way to do it, Mr. Speaker, is to slash civil service wages, have major layoffs, close hospitals, lay off teachers and nurses, close community schools. Mr. Speaker, we could have balanced the budget yesterday, but we're quite sure that's not what the people of Nova Scotia want. So if that member... In fact, Mr. Speaker, yesterday evening, the Halifax Chamber of Commerce sent out a commentary on the budget, and there was actually a line in it that said that the government tried too hard to be fair to everybody. Now, I had to read that line 2 or 3 times to make sure that it actually said that, because that was meant to be a criticism, Mr. Speaker. But you know what? I'm very proud to say that we were very fair to everybody. We tried to do that, and we succeeded. Mr. Speaker, if that member is going to continue to stand up and say that his party would have balanced the budget yesterday, I think it is incumbent on him to say how. What would he have cut? Because that's the really difficult question. That's the question on which we need to have a grown-up conversation in this province, Mr. Speaker, and shouting out slogans like that doesn't help anybody. We've got to deal with the situation as it actually is, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we took such a balanced approach in yesterday's budget. One of the other messages I got from Back to Balance, Mr. Speaker, very clearly and consistently, is Nova Scotians expect us to use every single dollar we receive as wisely and efficiently as we possibly can. And that's why it is incumbent on MLAs to accept that $1.3 million has been taken out of their expenses because MLAs, everyone from every party, has to demonstrate that they are subject to the same restraint as everybody else. And Mr. Speaker, we also said in yesterday's budget that of the $1.4 billion gap that we are trying to close, we will find $1.1 billion in savings and efficiencies between now and 2013. We're going to have to take on the big issues like pharmaceutical costs, like physician payments, like payments to universities, and the other payments, each of which individually is hundreds of millions of dollars of our budget. Now, Mr. Speaker, if that member and that party are going to deny us the revenue we need to make up the difference, then they have to identify the cuts that they would make, because I think the people of Nova Scotia want to know. So what we did, Mr. Speaker, we said that $1.1 billion of the gap is going to be closed by us making every dollar work harder than it has ever worked before. And then we said that we are going to take the rest, some $300 million per year, in new revenue measure. But, Mr. Speaker, one of the other things that I heard very clearly during the back to balance process, and I heard it for the first time at the Legion in Whitney Pier, which I believe you may be familiar with, Mr. Speaker, and which was repeated to me consistently throughout the province, is that if we're going to do that, it is necessary to take measures to protect those with low and modest incomes. And I'm pleased to say, Mr. Speaker, that in yesterday's budget, we did exactly that. We have implemented an affordable living tax credit that will return $70 million into the hands of those among us who are most in need. And in addition to that, Mr. Speaker, we have taken all the provincial tax off such essentials as children's clothing and footwear, feminine hygiene products, and diapers. And Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of that. And another thing that we did, Mr. Speaker, is we remembered the seniors, just like we did when the now Premier led the campaign to end the injustice of charging seniors in long-term care facilities for their health care. Mr. Speaker, I don't mind saying that once again it was the Premier's idea to remember the seniors by returning $12.5 million into the hands of the 18,000 seniors in Nova Scotia with the lowest income. Mr. Speaker, I am very proud of that measure as well, Mr. Speaker, because we understand that we need to remember our seniors in all the measures that we're taking. So not only can they, will any senior receiving the guaranteed income supplement pay zero provincial income tax, but they also qualify for the affordable living tax credit. Mr. Speaker, today I was at an event hosted by the member for Hammonds Plains Upper Sackville at a seniors lunch at the local community centre, Mr. Speaker, and I talked to the seniors there about the measures that we implemented in yesterday's budget, and I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that they were very pleased with what this government is doing for them. If that member would care to go to the same community centre and talk to those seniors, I think it's incumbent on him to say what it is that he would cut. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and please to rise today and speak on Bill 14. I think one of the very first things that we do need to review is what Deloitte had to say when they did a review of the province's finances. It was not an audit, as we were told would take place and that Nova Scotians were led to believe would take place. However, when they reviewed the books of the province from July and August, And when they appeared before public accounts on January the 20th, they made a very clear statement. And I can table that when I speak to this at another time. And that was, during their review, the worst case scenario for a deficit that the province was now facing was $51 million. And Shannon MacDonald stated it several times and very clearly. So what Nova Scotians are faced with the HST increase is to look after the $650 million spending spree that this government has gone on. Let's be very clear about that. And I think the minister would have been better served by a comprehensive tax review. You know, yes, we need revenue to run our programs. There's no question about that. But I think a fair distribution of where the hurt could have gone with a fairer taxation system rather than where the burden is placed now, and along with a comprehensive tax review, really sharpened the pencil, I think, with all departments. We were told in a national review of healthcare across the country that we have 1% above average in administration. Can you imagine a little province like Nova Scotia, and we have administration 1% above the national average? And as I told Global today, where would you have started? Where would you have started as the finance critic? I would have started with the 37 vice presidents in Capital Health. No question. No question. You take a look and discern all those jobs of 37 vice presidents. Do they need to be there? Is this the best investment of dollars? Take a look at community services. Management in community services has grown by almost 50% in 5 years, yet the number of recipients has not changed. Information management in community services has gone up over 5 years by 126%. We have not looked at making the hard decisions, and that's where we needed to go. This government took the easiest road of all jurisdictions that want to get extra revenue: raise taxes. And Nova Scotians earning between $35,000 and $83,000 have gotten hit with the burden. Yes, I'm pleased that our seniors and our low income, but below $30,000, that's only going to be neutralizing the effect of the HST. When we look at consumption tax on $30,000 and below until we get down to about $10,000, $12,000, $240 plus $57 will not cut it. And let's hope they don't have to buy a used car, because once we get to big ticket items, $240 don't go very far. So we made, I think, a very inaccurate premise to raise the HST. We have not gone into true restraint in Nova Scotia, and that's exactly what we needed. We're also using the HST to pay for some salary contracts that are near 10%. This government said it would go 1%. 1%. We know that most contracts have gone well beyond 1%. This minister is talking one way and acting another. He is not dealing with the essential toughness that this province needs. And the HST is an absolutely easy path. And to really fail Nova Scotians, and this is what I've heard on my emails today, they fail Nova Scotians because there's a central promise in their election campaign was a balanced budget with no tax increases. Now, I want Nova Scotians to continue to send me the emails that we've been getting, and I want them to be engaged and enraged at the false promise made by the NDP just 10 months ago. In one foul swoop, the NDP has taken money directly out of the pockets of families they swore to make a better life for. This government has told Nova Scotians that life will be more expensive. But for the NDP government, they've chosen the easy way for themselves. I really don't think the NDP government realizes the disastrous effect this tax will have on businesses, particularly in the tourism sector. And just moments ago, we heard from Gary Powell of Ambassadors. Along with the dollar reaching parity today, people start to ask not only what is the exchange rate, what is the exchange rate, but how much tax do they pay in this province when we buy something, when we get off a ship, when we come into Nova Scotia. And it doesn't take long today for that word to run through the internet, to run through the social media, that Nova Scotia will tax you tourists. And one of the things that worked, one of the things that worked in Nova Scotia, the minister had an opportunity to do, this government had an opportunity to do, and that was, as we did before, tourists could get a rebate on the tax. And you know what was good about it? They liked the idea. Very, very small percentage ever applied for the tax rebate. It would have been a wonderful, catchy thing to do, because we will devastate tourism in southwestern Nova Scotia this year. People know it, people feel it. Now the HST. The HST will, make no mistake, hotels, bed and breakfast, tourism operations in Nova Scotia will close, and especially in southwestern Nova Scotia. Tax increases are the easy way for this NDP government to avoid coming to terms with real governance. But this is the choice government has taken: higher taxes for everyone except that special group. We now have a special category in Nova Scotia. People who earn between $83,000 and $217,000 get a 1.7% tax break. That's right, ministers. You have gotten a tax shelter from the HST. You have gotten a tax shelter at $150,000, and I will table for the House. Mr. Dexter, who makes $196,000, will save $456. If you're at $150,000, you save $1,263.70, calculated by tax people here in the city, and I will table that for the minister's information. So he did give the ministers and that group of Nova Scotians a break from the HST. Just as the NDP broke the promise they made to Nova Scotians when they said they could balance a budget, remember that just about a year ago, without increasing taxes or cutting spending, the NDP has now turned their back on Cumberland County. Cumberland County will have the first sign up. We are the casualty of the HST, because on July 1st, gas taxes now go up. Gas taxes now go up more than 2 cents, because remember, it's a tax on a tax. Not a tax on a tax plus the 2% HST. We will see the trickle now move to a torrent out of Cumberland County into New Brunswick. And that's right, Mr. Minister, you've turned your back on Cumberland County, and the new minister in the House will be a one-termer. You can be guaranteed of that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the House for the opportunity to speak on Bill 14. And I want to first of all give credit to my honourable colleague from Inverness. Mr. Speaker, I predict this young man, I may not see it, but I think this young man will be sitting on the opposite side of the House in a very short time, sitting where the Minister of Finance is today. And Mr. Speaker, this young man has a bright future in politics. You know, Mr. Speaker, it was quite interesting. I heard during the debate, the Minister of Finance talked about how he'd gone around the province and listened to everyone and given everybody the opportunity to have input in regards to a very, very serious issue. But I didn't hear him say how much time in each meeting he actually gave people an opportunity to speak or to offer input or suggestions. But I would like to ask the minister this. Now, I don't know the answer from the Liberal Party. The finance critic can answer this, I guess. But I don't believe the Minister of Finance ever made the offer to our finance critic, young, bright mind, representing a generation that's coming behind us. Did he ever give him the opportunity to sit down face to face and look at some numbers and offer some solutions or suggestions that this young man may have? I think, Mr. Speaker, you know, Mr. Speaker, the NDP government of BC, traveled throughout the province of British Columbia to do the very thing the minister here did. I'm sure that he didn't think of this on his own. I'm sure the idea of traveling the province, listening to people, came from there. But however, Mr. Speaker, you have to look at why that was done. Were people actually given an honest opportunity to share input, give ideas, but were they given, it's like, Mr. Speaker, when you ask someone, you give them 3 options, but maybe there's 4 options, 5 and 6. What if the people had said to the minister, Minister, we don't think at this point in time in the history of this province, we can afford to buy land. We don't think you can afford to buy land. And Mr. Speaker, you know, when you think about that, the people were giving the
Order, please. Order. The honourable member for Kings West, that's unparliamentary, and I will ask you to retract that right away.
I will retract the comment, but please let the person on the floor speak.
The honourable member from Kings West, the Speaker is in charge of the order in this House, and I will determine when I will call order. The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, one thing I've learned in this House, the Honourable Minister of Finance, when you question him, when you challenge him, you're going to get the response I just got now. Mr. Speaker, I've heard from many, many people, and yes, I will say for the record, for personal reasons, I was unable to attend that meeting. And if I thought it was any business of the Honourable Minister of Finance, I would share it here, but for personal reasons, I wasn't there. But anyway, Mr. Speaker, he cannot stand to have himself challenged here. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I heard people throughout the meetings throughout the province say the very thing. Anyone challenges this minister, boy, I'll tell you, you're in for an earful from someone who does not want to be challenged. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, I will say this. Nova Scotians predicted this budget. Marilla Stevens said it today, didn't she? Borrow, tax, and spend. We've been saying that, Mr. Speaker, since last June. Look out, because these guys are going to borrow money, they're going to tax, and they're going to spend, and that's exactly what they've done here. And Mr. Speaker, my honourable colleague mentioned about Cumberland County. You know, Mr. Speaker, I may have not attended that meeting, but I'll tell you, I'm speaking on behalf of Cumberland County residents and business from the whole county, and I've heard it loud and clear in the last number of weeks, not just from my constituency, but from the whole county. Mr. Speaker, there's no question, as a result of the decision of this government, this Minister of Finance, we're seeing the loss of business. Some have already announced already they're not going to be able to survive. And you know, Mr. Speaker, it's very easy to stand in this House and say all kinds of things and offer solutions. Mr. Speaker, I've said before and I'll say it again, when something good is done by the government, I'll be the first to praise them. But I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, the Premier himself last week offered to myself to work with him and the government to find solutions for Cumberland County. Well, you know, the Minister of Finance may think this is funny, but I can tell you, when he goes to Cumberland County next week, he's going to see how funny, how people in Cumberland County, how funny they think this is. Mr. Speaker, I offered in a resolution the other day, I asked, because of the Premier's offer the other day in the House, he offered to work with myself. He asked me to work with the government. And that's a fair request, Mr. Speaker, a fair offer, because some of the issues have been very hot for the last week, but he offered that, Mr. Speaker. So in response to that, I introduced a resolution, and I don't have it here, but it basically said that I asked the Premier to form a committee. This was people in Cumberland County asked me to do this. To form a committee, Chamber of Commerce, Boards of Trade, Rural and Economic Development under the Minister, his staff, the CREDA, which would be the RDA, some business people, some citizens, to work with the government, the Premier and the government, to find solutions for Cumberland County residents. And Mr. Speaker, I think that's a pretty fair request. Now, I understand the government doesn't want to give credit to someone outside of their party. That's fair enough. They want to find a different way to do it. I have no problem with that, Mr. Speaker. But the other thing I've heard loud and clear, particularly from the media, Nova Scotia is a very small province. The maritime provinces are very small. We have less than 2 million people. And you know, Mr. Speaker, the problems we have, some of those same problems are faced by our neighbours in New Brunswick when it comes to taxes and in our area, cross-border shopping. Because make no mistake, there are a lot of New Brunswickers that come over to Amherst to shop. So, Mr. Speaker, I thought it was a fair request to ask the committee be struck, to work with those people I mentioned, and as well, Mr. Speaker, to look at Nova Scotia government, how we could actually help those businesses, and further than that, how the Premier could use the results of that information that he would gather to take to his Atlantic Premier colleagues to discuss the issue of cross-border shopping and other issues that affect Atlantic Canadians. And, Mr. Speaker, the answer from the government was no. No. Minister of Finance is going to go visit them next week. Well, that's great. I don't know if you read the paper today. They're expecting more platitudes, and they're expecting the minister to come and sit down and listen to them, but to offer what? The issue of cross-border shopping is way bigger than the price of gas for Cumberland County residents. We have people that I know are going to Brunswick to buy their groceries, to buy their gas, to buy all kinds of items, Mr. Speaker, and now with this rise in HST, am I running out of time, Mr. Speaker? Oh, I'm sorry, 1 minute. With this rise in the HST, it is going to cause a devastating blow to Cumberland County residents. Mr. Speaker, this was provided to me. A stagnant economy, an aging population, higher taxes equal one thing for us in Cumberland County, and that's disaster. And all I'm asking of this government, Mr. Speaker, is to reconsider the offer to Cumberland County to work with the people, the business people, the citizens who know their situation, their plight best. Mr. Speaker, the offer to come was made in sincerity, and I mean that, because the people in Cumberland County right now need the help, and they need the help of this government. Mr. Speaker, I'm again asking the Minister of Finance, who will be in Cumberland County next week to talk about the issue of cross-border shopping in New Brunswick. The Premier is the one that made the offer last week. I merely picked up on it, Mr. Speaker, declined by the government. I'm asking the Minister of Finance and the Premier again to come to the aid of business and the people in Cumberland County and to seriously look at issues that are affecting nowhere else in Nova Scotia but Cumberland County. Mr. Speaker, thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Thank you. We will now call resolution number 100. The honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to rise to speak on Resolution 100, a resolution urging this government to retain the soft tissue injury cap so that Nova Scotians can continue to enjoy more affordable auto insurance. Why did I put this resolution forward? Mr. Speaker, the cap has worked. Now, this government will tell you that for those who have suffered injuries, it has not worked. But I want people to know that the cap applies only to injuries that are minor and injuries that will heal. And that's not in the eyes of Premier Dexter, it's not in my eyes, it's in the eyes of a qualified physician. And that is important. Pain and suffering is hard to quantify. It's easy for those in the legal profession to quantify. Some of them make tidy profits by debating the subjectivity of pain and suffering in court. For example, I have heard about court cases where claims were made by lawyers on behalf of their clients for pain and suffering in a circumstance where the two automobiles involved hadn't even made physical contact. This is abuse. When claims of $20,000 or more are awarded for these instances, the auto premiums for Nova Scotians go up. And those are the people that live in our communities, on all sides of the House. And that is why the Progressive Conservatives put that cap in place. Allowing physicians to use their professional opinion to determine injuries that are suitable for the cap is better than leaving it for the courts to decide. The alternative offered by this government make life more expensive for people. How much did the cap save Nova Scotians? Well, since the Ham government put the cap in place in 2003, Nova Scotians have enjoyed 25% and in some cases even more savings on their auto insurance. It's working, Mr. Speaker. So if your auto insurance premium was $1,000 in 2002, it became $800, a $200 savings. That's $200 in the pockets of Nova Scotians that they can spend on something else in our province to help our economy. And as one member just mentioned to me, they can now use that to pay extra HST. So I wonder why the minister didn't tell people he was going to make a decision to take from Nova Scotians $200 of their hard-earned after-tax income in the budget yesterday, because that is effectively what will happen when this cap is removed. The cap has made auto insurance more affordable for Nova Scotians, and on behalf of Nova Scotians and this Progressive Conservative Party, I ask that your NDP government keep the cap. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's evident to me that the honourable member hasn't spoken to anybody who's actually been subjected to the cap, because if he had, he would know how the cap actually works in the real world. Mr. Speaker, as a result of our review of the minor injury cap, we've received almost 200 submissions, the vast majority of them being from accident victims who've described in detail how the minor injury cap has adversely affected their lives and their families' lives, Mr. Speaker, because we said from the very beginning, Mr. Speaker, that the minor injury cap was unfair, and one of the reasons it's unfair, Mr. Speaker, is because of the persistent myth peddled by that party when they brought it in that it applied only to minor injuries. But, Mr. Speaker, it does not apply only to minor injuries. As I said at the time, and as I will say again, the way the law passed by the Conservatives and supported by the Liberals is worded, it says, well, it's as if saying, well, the cap applies only to mice. But then it defines every animal smaller than an elephant to be a mouse. That's how the cap works, Mr. Speaker. There are some people with terrible, painful, life-changing injuries who have been subjected to the so-called minor injury cap. Mr. Speaker, that's not fair. And, Mr. Speaker, that's simply not fair. And another part of the cap that they don't seem to take into account is it was set far too low at $2,500. And what the insurance companies typically do is they take that as a maximum, so it takes very serious and painful injuries to get $2,500, and then it's down from there. And Mr. Speaker, that's not fair. It's been in effect for 7 years, and there has been no inflation or cost of living adjustment at all. That's not fair. And Mr. Speaker, I know it's easy for members to caricature the personal injury lawyers, Mr. Speaker, but I'll tell you what happens in the real world, Mr. Speaker, is that lawyers provide advice to people on how to get the maximum compensation allowed for by their insurance premium, Mr. Speaker, which seems only fair. What happens now, of course, is that with the cap, there's not enough money there for lawyers to deal with, and so a lot of people are approaching their insurance company without professional advice. And not only that, Mr. Speaker, something the member neglected to mention is among all the other changes, that party reversed the onus of proof so that now the onus is on the injured person to show that they don't have a minor injury, rather than putting the onus on the insurance company to show that they do. And of course, Mr. Speaker, most people can't afford to get the kind of professional and specialist advice that they need in order to make their case to the insurance company. So what's happened is that a large number of injured people, genuinely, seriously injured people, and that member really ought to know better, Mr. Speaker. He caricatures those injured people as people abusing the system. If anybody's abusing the system, Mr. Speaker, if anybody's abusing the system, their claim is denied. That's the way it works. But what happens, Mr. Speaker, is a lot of genuinely injured people are not getting fair compensation for their injuries. So what we've done, Mr. Speaker, is we've said, while respecting the need for affordable premiums, we are going to restore fairness to the system. Now, we did this in an open process. We put out a consultation paper, Mr. Speaker. We've consulted the major stakeholders, such as the insurance industry, which we've consulted every step of the way, the Insurance Brokers Association, Mr. Speaker, because brokers deliver the auto insurance product in every community around the province, Mr. Speaker, we've left the door open to everybody to come and talk to us, to identify what the issues are. And Mr. Speaker, it's clear that the member hasn't even talked to the insurance industry because they agree that there are some issues with the cap, Mr. Speaker, and they agree that some changes are necessary. So what we're trying to do, Mr. Speaker, is make sure that the system is both affordable and fair. I will be shortly introducing in this House legislation that will balance affordability, Mr. Speaker, with fairness. And Mr. Speaker, we are going to do that in a way that is going to be acceptable to all the stakeholders, that is going to make the system more fair. It's the right thing to do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's my pleasure to say a few words today on Resolution 100, which is talking about the insurance cap and was raised by my colleague from the Conservative Party. In listening to the Minister of Finance's few words on this, and I must admit we only had a few minutes to talk about it, my concern is just what is being proposed and what does the Minister of Finance consider fair. And I'm kind of going back in time to some of the things that the NDP have proposed, and they certainly, when the discussion was ongoing here in the House in 2003, there was definitely discussion about a publicly owned and operated insurance system. You know, that is of concern to us. That's not something that I would ever support. And Mr. Speaker, at the time, I had said that that would cost hundreds of, well, perhaps at least $100 million. I know it was scoffed at by the NDP at the time, but you know, it would indeed cost that for less than 1 million people. So there's been some improvements in the time since 2003, but I agree with the minister on one point, and that is that as the former finance critic for the Liberal Party, I definitely have talked to people who were injured in this past 7 years, who had very serious injuries in car accidents, and who were not able to access the kind of help and financial compensation that you know, really they needed and deserved. So in the area of fairness, I believe there are some cases that, you know, really did call for a different response. And I found it interesting that the minister mentioned the mice analogy, because he actually mentioned that at law amendments in 2003 concerning what would the definition be of a minor injury. And if we're looking at the history of that change, we know that in 2003 the issue of high insurance costs, high rates of to be insured for driving had become a key issue in that election. It overtook every other issue of importance, like health and education. And as soon as the election was over, the government moved quickly to make some changes. I would say in that instance, I think this is an excellent opportunity for me to say that the Liberal Party did support a cap on minor injuries, but the definition that was devised behind closed doors by the government of the day, which was the Conservative government, went far beyond our expectations of minor injury, and in fact was really duplicitous, if I can say that word here in the House. It was not what we had intended, and what I would like to see in any change, and I have no idea what the minister and the NDP government are proposing, but I would like to see that regulation brought into line with what indeed is a minor injury. I think this is something that could be corrected by adjusting that to really reflect what the members of this House felt was fair at the time that they voted on that new law, because that was passed here. It went through law amendments. We talked to people who had been injured, and I remember at the time at law amendments hearing from some people who had been injured in accidents, and they said really the people losing here today are those people who have yet to be injured. And they made that point that we don't know whether it be ourselves, one of our loved ones, somebody that we represent, who may be the person who was hurt at the end of the day. I mean, the law has been successful in bringing down the number of people who couldn't find insurance. The numbers that were being insured through that facility association, which was sort of an insurer of last resort, has gone down from 8.1% in 03 to 2.2% in 2009. So that's a positive thing, that more people are able to access insurance, and their rates have come down as well, and I believe that was already mentioned. So there were positive things about it, but the definition of a minor injury injury was really misconstrued, and I would be the first to say that, and I think that really the Conservative Party at the time did us a disservice, and the people of Nova Scotia a disservice in going so far in the direction of what is a minor injury that it would be unrecognizable to somebody with an injury. People that are very seriously injured and may never recover their former capacities are being considered to be minor injuries, and that's not what we ever intended, Mr. Speaker. So with that, I would certainly like to pose the question of that, or indicate that we're worried about what the NDP may be proposing. We'd like to know more about this. They say they've had consultation, but we haven't seen it. And Mr. Speaker, with that, I would also say that we are not in the dire straits we were at in 2003, and I don't know that a complete overhaul is required. I think a small change to the regulation under the definition of a minor injury would suffice. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. The member for Hansworth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to have a few short minutes this afternoon to speak to this very important topic. And I guess from a little bit of experience in a previous life, and I know that side of the House has a former paramedic over there who would know a little something about injury as well. We've heard quite a bit of discussion about the injury itself today, the definition. What does that mean? Perhaps there is an issue. I think the review, okay, fine, the review is there, that we have no control over that. The minister's going, the government going to put that in place. The issue here is what will it do, really? You talk about fairness, but what will it do to the rest of us who are buying insurance at reasonable, although still high? Insurance will always say, I think most would say the insurance rates are still high, regardless of what it is we're insuring. We don't want this to go up. This was put in place to protect all of us from extreme rates, and we need to keep that at a level that's also fair to folks driving, insuring their homes, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever insurance, the rates will go up. We're confident that the rates will go up. We've done some preliminary on that, and we know that they were skyrocketing at the time, hence the reason it was put in place. But, Mr. Speaker, we have to think about what does the injury mean, and I think people should be treated fairly too. I come from a world, as I said, a former healthcare professional who saw my share of injuries. The issue has been, what is a traumatic injury? What is a soft tissue injury? I think it's a very tough decision that we leave to the courts, unfortunately, to decide. And people will always, who are injured, people will always feel, from my past experience, feel that they've not been treated enough. When you're looking at $2,500, maybe that's not enough. Maybe the review will say it's $3,000. I don't know what that figure will be, Mr. Speaker, but there is room for that review. I'm not personally opposed to that review. I think it's appropriate. The issue will be, how far do we go? We have to be fair to everyone. There's the big question. Will we be fair to everyone in the end of the day? And that fairness to everyone means us as ratepayers as well. Also those that are injured, I think it's fine. But we have great technology in the healthcare system today. It evolves every year. It gets better and better and better. We should be able to define what these injuries consist of. What does that mean? What is a soft tissue injury? There are injuries that will always be the whiplash type injury, the back pain type injury that are not out there, that totally represent and are seen on x-rays, are seen on MRIs, and can't be defined. There will always be a fight in the courts over those types of injuries. But something that worries me more than anything else, and I've seen over the years as well, is what happens when the rates go too high? We're going to have drivers who are now driving without insurance because they can't afford it. That's what's going to happen. That will make life, that's not fair. It's not fair to those folks who can't afford it to be fined and charged. It's costing them even more money. In the end of the day, it'll be in court for them. God knows what will happen in between if there are accidents. Who will pay? Who will pay on, and they injure somebody in a motor vehicle accident. Who will pay then? We see these circumstances, fortunately, at a very, very low rate today. I think that the majority of drivers are doing the right thing. They're insuring their vehicles. But I would ask the minister and the government, when they're doing this review, to consider being fair to everyone. I want you to be fair to those that are injured. Define what, soft tissue is. Define what the cap should represent if there is, in fact, a cap left, and I hope that there is. And I would say perhaps there's room for increases in that figure. It hasn't moved in 7, 8 years, whatever it's been since it's gone in now. Perhaps there's room to move that again. But this is costing the system by opening it up. It will cost the system. There'll be more court cases. It'll go longer. People will never be happy. You're not going to be able to win that one, in my opinion, from the experience that I've had on the street. I've seen this many, many, many times over. People's injuries are hard sometimes to define. You can't see them. Those are the ones that we'll be worried about the most. We're going to see court cases. They'll be drug out. Lawyers will have a field day with this. They'll enjoy going to court because it's how they make their living, in all fairness to the lawyers. Nothing against the lawyers, but it is how they do it. But where are we going to fit them in? The courts are already overrun with cases now. We have no time to take these things to court. We have to wrap it up. We have to put something in place that works but must be fair for all parties involved, and that includes the ratepayer. It's very important, and I would consider or hope that the minister and his government would consider, again, I would ask that, all of these things when making that decision and bringing forward and reviewing anything that comes forward with regards to this cap and any changes that could potentially be brought forward in your proposed legislation. I hope that the time has been given that needs to be given to this, and we look forward to debating the piece of legislation that will come forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know we had a couple of minutes here. Thank you.
Thank you. The time allocated for debate on resolution number 100 has now expired. Chair will recognize the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That concludes opposition members' business for the day.
Thank you. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request that the House now rise to meet again tomorrow between the hours of 2 to 6, where after daily routine and orders of the day, we'll call the budget estimates.
Thank you. The motion before the House is for the House to now rise and meet the Honourable Government House Leader.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. I meant to say 12 to 6 tomorrow.
Thank you. The motion before the House is for the House to now rise and meet again tomorrow between the hours of 12 noon and 6 p.m. Is the House ready for the question? Question has been called. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Those against, motion carried. The House now stands adjourned until 12 noon tomorrow. We have now arrived at the moment of interruption. The adjournment debate was chosen earlier and won by the Honourable Member from Cape Breton Nova. The motion therefore be resolved that the House of Assembly recognize the vital importance of youth programs and after-school initiatives such as the Whitney Peer Youth Club and the Bay St. Lawrence Community Centre, recent recipients of funding through the Lighthouse Grant Program. The Chair will now recognize